Shouldn't you be serving the drinks? The voice was loud enough to slice through the music, through the laughter, through every conversation in the glass-walled hall. For a moment, the entire resort dining room froze, eyes shifting toward the man standing near the fireplace. He wasn't staff. He wasn't a waiter. He was Daniel Ward, son of the CEO hosting the summit. But in that instant, every chuckle and whisper treated him like he didn't belong at all. Daniel stood still in his plain charcoal suit, the same one he'd worn more than once, the one that made him look like an afterthought in a room full of tailored tuxedos and shimmering gowns. His hair wasn't slicked back. His tie wasn't designer. He wore nothing that announced wealth. The only thing that stood out was the worn wristwatch on his arm. His late mother's, the one he never removed. The young heir of the Preston family, Blake, leaned back in his chair and smirked, lifting his glass higher so everyone saw the wine swirl. "Come on, Daniel. Don't just stand there. If you're not pouring for us, at least take a seat at the staff table in the back." A ripple of laughter spread. Not the light, harmless kind. Sharp, cutting laughter that grew bolder with every second Daniel stayed silent. The air shifted, heads tilted, eyes narrowed. He wasn't invisible, he was being erased, step by step, in front of people who once treated him as untouchable. A woman at the table whispered to her friend, not quietly enough. "That's the CEO's son? He looks like he got lost on his way to the kitchen." Her friend giggled, glancing at Daniel, as if he were an exhibit to be ridiculed. Glasses clinked, forks tapped plates, and the atmosphere thickened with a mocking energy. People avoided his eyes, but not out of respect, out of complicity. They didn't want to challenge the Preston family. It was easier to laugh along, easier to let him shrink alone. Daniel's throat tightened, but his face remained steady. He shifted slightly, his fingers brushing the watch on his wrist, grounding himself in the weight of memory. He remembered his father's words from years ago. "Stand tall, even when you're alone. Silence has its own strength." But silence felt heavy when the entire hall was stacked against him. Someone behind him murmured just loud enough. "Can't believe a CEO would bring that to a summit." That. Not him. That. The word cut deeper than the laughter. Daniel exhaled slowly, eyes scanning the glass windows that looked out over the mountain peaks, the cold night pressing against the warmth inside. He stood in a room where he was supposed to be respected, maybe even celebrated, yet he was treated like furniture unseen until it was time to be mocked. He looked across the tables, saw a few hesitant glances, people shifting uncomfortably but staying quiet. They weren't with him. They weren't against him. They just refused to risk their place. That isolation, being surrounded and yet abandoned, sank deeper than any insult. Maybe you know that feeling. When you're in a room full of people and still made to feel like you don't exist. If you've ever carried that silence, I'd like to hear about it. Share your experience, it matters. Blake raised his voice again, pleased at the attention. "Tell me, Daniel, did your father forget to bring his heir, so he sent you instead?" Another round of laughter erupted, sharper this time, fueled by cruelty and the safety of numbers. Daniel's chest tightened. The glances, the whispers, the smirks, they all folded into one suffocating truth. They didn't see him as an heir, or as a man, or even as present. He was being erased. Step by deliberate step. In the very hall, built for leaders. The waiter walking past slowed briefly, eyes flicking to Daniel. There was pity there. Maybe even a quiet apology. But he kept moving. Even kindness here couldn't linger. Daniel steadied his breathing. No smile. No words. He just stood, still and unyielding, letting the silence around him grow heavy enough to make a few of them shift uncomfortably. And in that silence, a thought cut through. They thought they'd reduced him to nothing. They thought his presence here was a mistake, but they hadn't realized that silence has its own sharp edge. If moments like this strike something in you, if they remind you of the times you were underestimated, stay close to these stories. It helps to walk through them together. The music swelled again, glasses lifted, and the room pretended to move on. But no one had really looked away. Not from him. Not from the boy they mocked as if he didn't belong. The night pressed on. Plates clattered softly. The hum of conversations returned, but the tension clung to the air like smoke that refused to clear. Daniel sat at a side table now, not quite at the center, not quite in the shadows. That was the place they left for people who didn't matter, close enough to observe, far enough to be ignored. The Preston family commanded the main table, voices rising above the music, their confidence filling every corner of the hall. Charles Preston, the patriarch, spoke like his words were gospel. By the end of this summit, he announced, our agreement with Ward Enterprises will reshape the industry. $600 million, gentlemen. A new empire in the making. Applause followed, glasses lifted, the sound swelling with certainty. Daniel's jaw clenched. He knew the deal his father had been negotiating for months. He knew the weight behind it. Yet the Prestons spoke as though it was already theirs, as though his father's company was just a stepping stone for their dominance. Blake leaned back in his chair, eyes sliding toward Daniel like a predator, enjoying the sight of a trapped animal. Hope you're paying attention, Daniel, he called out across the room. This is what real leadership looks like. Try to take notes before dessert is served. Laughter again, louder this time, fueled by the alcohol, the applause, the certainty of power. Daniel's face stayed unreadable, his hand resting on the worn watch that anchored him. A waiter passed behind him, carefully balancing a tray of wine glasses. Blake shifted suddenly, his chair scraping back. With a single deliberate move, he bumped into Daniel, the red liquid spilling down Daniel's shirt in a slow, merciless stain. Blake gasped theatrically. "Oh, forgive me," he said, his tone dripping with mock sympathy. "Guess I mistook you for a napkin." The hall erupted. Not everyone laughed, but the sound was sharp enough to cut. Phones lifted discreetly, recording, flashes flickering in the glass walls. Daniel felt the cold wine soak through his shirt, but he didn't move. He didn't give them the reaction they were hungry for. Across the room, a staff member appeared with a towel, stepping forward quickly. He handed it to Daniel, his eyes steady, his voice low. "Here, don't let them see it get to you." Then he stepped away, vanishing back into the rhythm of service. For the first time that night, Daniel's expression softened just slightly, the smallest acknowledgement of kindness. He dabbed at the stain, folded the towel neatly, and placed it on the table beside him. The mockery lost some of its edge in that moment. Though the Prestons carried on, determined to keep the spectacle alive. Veronica Preston raised her glass, diamonds glittering on her wrist. "A toast," she declared, her voice ringing. "To new partnerships and to remembering that not everyone born into wealth deserves to wear it." The crowd clinked glasses. Daniel's chest tightened, but his breathing stayed steady. He didn't answer. He didn't even look their way. In a room full of power, he was being treated as if he didn't exist. That was the game they wanted to erase him, to make him nothing. And yet, silence has weight. His refusal to join their show of arrogance unsettled some of the guests. Daniel noticed the shift, the brief glance of a man adjusting his tie, the uncomfortable sip from a woman's glass. The way a few eyes darted toward him, and away again. Not allies. Not yet. But doubt was creeping in. It's a strange thing, isn't it? When cruelty goes too far, even strangers start questioning it. Have you ever watched that happen? When the room turns uneasy because someone is being pushed past the line? If that moment has ever stayed with you, I'd like you to share it. It's the kind of story people need to hear. The night moved forward. But the stain on his shirt remained, a silent mark they thought would shame him. Daniel let it sit. He didn't hide it. He let it speak, louder than their laughter. The Prestons leaned in closer with their allies. Voices rising again. Blake smirked across the room. 600 million, he said loudly, locking eyes with Daniel. By this time tomorrow, we'll own the future. You'll just be a spectator. The table cheered. Daniel pressed his fingers against the watch on his wrist. His silence remained unbroken, but the weight in his eyes had shifted from enduring to calculating, and though the room didn't know it yet, the balance of power had already started to tilt. The stain on Daniel's shirt had dried into a dark patch, impossible to miss, but he made no move to cover it. The hall's lights reflected off the glass walls, the mountains beyond barely visible in the night. Inside, the air buzzed with confidence and money. Outside, silence stretched endlessly. Charles Preston leaned forward at the head of the table, his voice booming with the weight of authority. By morning, he declared, the papers will be signed, $600 million, a new empire forged. Applause rolled across the hall. Guests raised their glasses, eager to be part of a celebration that hadn't even happened yet. To them, the deal was inevitable. The Ward family was already a conquered piece in the Preston story. Daniel's hand brushed the wristwatch again, the cool metal pressing into his skin. The watch was simple, scratched from years of wear. His mother's. She had given it to him when he was 15, smiling as she fastened it on his wrist. Your father will teach you how to run things, she had said softly, but this will remind you who you are when they try to strip it away. He hadn't taken it off since. The voices around him blurred for a moment, as the memory sat heavy in his chest. His father's teachings came back, too. Those quiet lessons delivered not in boardrooms, but over dinner, or during drives when the world felt less sharp. Don't fight to prove your worth to loud men, his father would say. Strength isn't noise. It's steady hands when others lose theirs. And yet here he was, reduced to a spectacle in the very summit his family had helped build. Blake Preston raised his voice, cutting through the music. Ward Enterprises should be honored, he said loudly, smirking toward Daniel. Joining forces with us is the best thing that could ever happen to them. Laughter followed. Not universal, some smiles were thin, forced, but the arrogance carried. Blake leaned back, soaking in the attention, the heir who thought cruelty was charm. Daniel stayed still, his expression unreadable. His silence wasn't weakness, it was a wall, but the sting was real. He could feel every look, every dismissal, every whisper branding him as less. Across the hall, a group of younger executives leaned together, stage whispering, if that's the CEO's son, no wonder the Prestons are confident. The kid's a ghost. The words landed heavy, but Daniel let them pass. He tightened his grip on the watch, steadying himself. Sometimes silence carries a message louder than words, but it doesn't always feel strong when you're the one holding it. It feels isolating. If you've ever carried that kind of silence, where you know speaking won't change the room, but you still refuse to bow your head, those are the moments that stay with you. And those are the stories that deserve to be remembered. Charles Preston rose again, glass in hand. To new beginnings, he thundered. To a future we will control. His eyes swept the room before landing on Daniel. The pause was deliberate, the smirk sharp. And to those who should learn when to stay out of the way, the crowd laughed and clinked glasses. Daniel didn't lift his. He didn't need to. The watch ticked softly against his wrist. Steady, relentless, unchanging. The night carried on into the outdoor terrace. The resort staff had lit a bonfire in the courtyard, flames rising against the mountain air. Guests gathered with drinks in hand, their laughter echoing under the open sky. The fire crackled, sharp and restless, while conversations swirled around it. The Prestons took the center again, as if the summit itself revolved around them. Blake climbed onto the low stone edge near the flames, glass raised high, his grin stretched wide, his voice cutting through the night. A toast, he called, eyes locking on Daniel across the crowd, to the Ward family for giving us the privilege of absorbing them into something greater. The room chuckled. Glasses lifted. Blake wasn't finished. And let's not forget young Daniel, he added, his smirk widening. The man of the hour, though I'm still not sure what hour that island. Maybe coffee service? Or coat check? The laughter rolled louder, bolder. Some clapped. Others shook their heads, but said nothing. A few looked away, uncomfortable, but unwilling to intervene. The fire's glow-lit faces that enjoyed the spectacle, their smiles sharp, their glances cutting. Daniel stood near the edge of the group, the stain still visible on his shirt, the watch steady on his wrist. His posture didn't falter. He didn't give them a word. Blake tipped his glass dramatically, bowing slightly in mock respect. Here's to the silent heir. May he one day speak up if he ever finds a voice. This time the laughter stung sharper. It wasn't just mockery anymore. It was dismissal. Erasure. Daniel exhaled slowly, his chest tightening against the weight of every eye on him. His father's voice echoed in his memory. Steady hands, Daniel. They'll try to pull you into their noise. Don't let them. Around the fire, a woman in emerald leaned toward her companion, murmuring just loud enough. Why is he even here? He doesn't belong in this circle. Her companion chuckled and nodded. Another whisper followed. Invisible. That's all he island. The words landed cold, pressing into him harder than the laughter. He wasn't invisible. He was being forced invisible. And they enjoyed it. The flames roared, sparks leaping upward. The Prestons' laughter filled the air like they had already won, like the $600 M deal was inked in blood, untouchable. Daniel's hand moved slowly to the watch on his wrist. He pressed his fingers against it, steady, grounding himself in the weight of memory. He didn't smile. He didn't scowl. He simply shifted his posture, calm and deliberate. The noise around him dulled for a moment. He pulled out his phone. No flourish, no theatrics, just a simple, quiet motion that went unnoticed by most, until the ones who did notice suddenly fell silent. In a crowd that believed he was nothing, he was preparing to show them otherwise. Daniel's phone was steady in his hand. No rush, no flinch. He stepped a little away from the fire's glow, enough that his voice wouldn't be drowned in the laughter. He pressed the device to his ear. The noise around him blurred into the background until one voice answered. His father's. Calm, familiar, steady. Dad, Daniel said quietly, but with a firmness that carried, if you trust me, end it now. For a breath, silence hung on the line. Then his father's voice, louder this time, carried clearly enough for the closest guests to hear. If my son says so, the $600 million deal is over. The laughter stopped like a switch had been thrown. Glasses froze in mid-air. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even the fire seemed to crackle quieter. Blake's smirk faltered, his glass tilting dangerously in his hand. His mother's face stiffened, the diamonds on her wrist catching the firelight as her fingers twitched. Charles Preston blinked hard, struggling to understand what had just happened. The silence stretched until the sound of footsteps cut through it. A man in a dark suit entered the terrace, briefcase in hand. He walked directly to Daniel, opened the folder, and spoke with clarity meant for everyone to hear. Per instructions, the contract is void. Effective tonight. Gasps rippled across the courtyard. Guests exchanged wide-eyed glances, some reaching instinctively for their phones. A few whispered frantically, their words swallowed by the tension. Blake stepped forward, voice shaking but loud. You can't just... This is a joke, right? Tell them it's a joke. Daniel lowered his phone slowly, slipping it into his pocket with measured calm. He didn't look at Blake. He didn't need to. Veronica's smile cracked, her voice trembling with disbelief. Do you have any idea what you've done? Daniel's gaze was cold when it finally met hers. Yes, the word was simple, sharp, and final. Charles's voice boomed, desperate now. This was a $600 million empire in the making. You think you can destroy it with one call? But the guests had already heard the confirmation. They had seen the documents. The deal was gone. Whispers turned into murmurs, murmurs into frantic conversation. Phones lit up, some recording, others typing as fast as fingers could move. The fire still burned, but the air had shifted completely. Blake's hand trembled, the wine in his glass spilling onto the stones at his feet. His arrogance drained away, replaced by something he'd never shown before: fear. Daniel adjusted his wristwatch. Calm, silent, unshaken. Around him, the empire that had mocked him was already beginning to crack. By dawn, the summit no longer carried the same tone. Conversations were clipped, faces drawn. Phones buzzed constantly. Every guest had seen it unfold, and by morning, the rest of the world had too. Headlines spread across every outlet. CEO's son ends, $600 M deal in a single call. Summit stunned, as Preston's merger collapses overnight. Clips from the bonfire were everywhere. Blake mocking Daniel, the cruel toast, the wine-stained shirt, followed by the silence when the deal was voided. Millions watched, and the comments were ruthless. Blake wasn't celebrated anymore. He was torn apart. Investors began withdrawing before breakfast. Messages poured in from partners cutting ties. The Preston empire, so confident just hours before, was bleeding credibility. At the resort, the atmosphere was tense. Blake didn't show his face. Veronica sat in a corner, phone in hand, voice low and frantic, trying to salvage connections that were already slipping away. Charles paced, jaw tight, muttering promises no one believed. Daniel walked past them once in the hallway. They looked up, desperate, but he didn't slow. His silence cut deeper than words could. By noon, more news came. Blake had been removed from the company's board. Veronica's foundation lost its top donors. Charles was left fielding questions he couldn't answer. Each headline carved away at their image. Guests at the summit whispered in smaller groups now. No more laughter, no more jokes. Their glances at Daniel were different, cautious, measured, laced with respect they hadn't shown before. He remained the same. Shirt still stained, watch still steady on his wrist. His expression calm. He didn't gloat. He didn't need to. The collapse of the Preston Empire wasn't loud or explosive. It was quiet, piece by piece, unraveling in real time. Their name, once untouchable, was now a caution whispered in corners. Don't overreach. Don't humiliate the wrong person. Don't mistake silence for weakness. Daniel said nothing. He simply observed, letting the weight of the moment settle on its own. Sometimes that's the sharpest way to win, not by shouting, but by refusing to lower yourself to the noise. The summit ended quietly. No grand closing speech. No final celebration. People packed their things early. Their conversations hushed. The Prestons slipped away before the last session, their departure unannounced, their silence louder than any excuse they might have given. Daniel left without fanfare. He didn't wait for apologies that wouldn't come. He simply returned home with his father, carrying nothing new except the respect of those who had seen what unfolded. The next morning, the ward offices felt different. Executives who once overlooked him now hesitated before speaking, their voices careful, their eyes attentive. When Daniel walked into the boardroom, the room stilled. His father sat at the head of the table, the weight of years in his posture, but his gaze sharp. He didn't introduce his son. He didn't need to. Everyone already knew. An executive cleared his throat. His words measured. Daniel, what's your view on the next phase of strategy? Daniel spoke clearly, his tone steady. He didn't rush. Every word was precise, landing firmly. When he finished, silence held for a beat, then came nods, murmurs of agreement, pens scratching notes. His father leaned back slightly, a faint smile in his eyes. "You don't need to prove anything anymore," he said. "You already have." Daniel's fingers brushed the wristwatch. Still ticking. Still steady. He didn't gloat. He didn't replay the moment. He didn't need to. The room's respect said enough. They had tried to humiliate him, to strip him down until he was nothing. Instead, he walked away as the one who had ended their $600 million empire with a single call. Sometimes the loudest response is silence. Sometimes the sharpest victory is restraint. And if you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever been written off and later proven your worth, you know how powerful that moment feels. Stay with these stories because they remind us we're not alone when we're dismissed, and they remind us what strength looks like when it finally speaks.